Do first-gen college students face an uphill battle? An exploratory latent class analysis. The purpose of the study was to consider how first-gen and continuing generation college students differ in areas of parental support and academic expectations. Perceived parental support is involved with college motivation. So the more that students perceive parental support, the increase seen in college motivation, college satisfaction, learner empowerment, cognitive learning, college enrollment expectations, even including college GPA. All right. First generation college students make up about 40% of all incoming freshmen, and this is a nationwide statistic. And first generation college students come in with some handicaps. They have lower enjoyment of reading and writing. They have lower self-efficacy and academic expectations. They tend to live off campus. They usually have to work more. They have lower college GPA, and they're typically involved in fewer extracurricular activities. Importantly, they also tend to report lower parental support, where we just saw parental support is attached to so many positive outcomes. One of the things first-generation college students do have is higher perceived barriers to college and the amount of time they spend working. And so what this results in is that they have dissatisfaction with their faculty interaction, whether it is because of the working or because of the lower self-efficacy. They tend to report less frequent faculty interaction, and when they do have interaction, it tends to be on the negative side. And then they report that their parental support does not support their academic behavior. And so what we're seeing here is that the psychological support and help that they're getting from their parents really does feed into the lower self-efficacy and the lower overall enjoyment of the academic setting. The current study is guided by the framework of self-determination theory. Self-determination theory is a motivation theory that distinguishes between the motivation involved in self-determined acts versus controlled or coerced acts. In an academic setting, self-determined, intrinsically motivated behaviors are engaged in voluntarily by the learner. For example, a student enjoys solving math problems or reading literature, whereas controlled, extrinsically motivated behaviors are engaged in by the learner through coercion or defiance, for example, for a good grade or to avoid punishment. Self-determination theory proposes 4 types of extrinsically motivated regulation: external, introjected, identified, and integrated. In external regulation, the learner's motivation is initiated by an external source, such as the threat of after-school detention or the reward of gold stars for good behavior. Introjected regulation involves the internalization of rules or expectations that pressure the learner to behave in a certain way, such as feeling guilt for earning a low grade or feeling important when asked to help the teacher with a special project. In identified regulation, the learner values the consequences or utility of the motivated behavior and engages in it more voluntarily, such as a learner practicing the piano an extra 30 minutes to improve his or her performance at a scholarship audition. Integrated regulation refers to the incorporation of the motivated behavior within a learner's sense of self. For example, a learner who identifies him or herself as a good student is motivated to use effective study skills because that is what a good student does. And then internalization is the process by which previously extrinsically motivated behaviors actually become intrinsically motivating to the learner. There is a strong connection between self-determination theory and perceived parental support. Parents have a key opportunity to provide context and socialization to meet their children's needs for autonomy, competence, relatedness, and overall well-being. When parents socialize their child through the use of conditional regard, so giving love when the child behaves according to the parent's desires and withholding love when he or she does not, the child's need for autonomy can be thwarted. While the child may do as the parent wishes, the behavior is coerced rather than self-determined. Parental conditional regard has been associated with negative affective characteristics in college students, such as inner conflict, low self-worth, short-lived satisfaction, shame and guilt, fluctuations in self-esteem, feeling disapproved of, resentment of the parents, and poor coping skills. By the same token, perceived parental control positively predicted depressive symptoms and was correlated with separation individuation difficulty among college students. So we can see where lack of autonomy, lack of warmth really plays into a decrease in self-determination. Conversely, college students' perceptions of parental support of their autonomy have repeatedly been associated with positive academic and psychological outcomes. Perceived parental support has been positively correlated with self-esteem, self-regulation, mental health, autonomous motivation, vitality, and self-actualization among college students. The research question here is, using latent class analysis, what classes of students emerge based on the variables of first-generation college student status, perceived parental support, and academic expectations. The hypothesis is, because this is an exploratory, using latent class analysis, what classes of students emerge based on the variables of first-generation college student status, perceived parental support, and academic expectations. As a hypothesis, because this is an exploratory latent class analysis, I don't really have a specific hypothesis, but I do expect that at least one class will consist primarily of first-generation college students, and that at least one class will consist primarily of continuing generation college students, so I can get some sort of a classification scheme based on generation status. Who participated in this study? We had 70 USC Upstate students enrolled in elementary statistics. In looking descriptively at the generation status, 40% were first generation status, which hits the national average on the head at 40%. 36% were second generation, and 24% were third or more generation. Racially, saw a ton of diversity. Only 44% were Caucasian, 35% were Black or African American, and then we had mixes of other races as smaller percentages. The survey consisted of a self-determination scale, which was 10 questions, and this scale was asking the student about how well they perceived choice in their lives and how aware of their self that they were. The perceptions of parents were 21 questions per parent that asked questions about involvement, how involved that parent was in their life, how much autonomy that parent provided, and how much warmth that parent gave the student. And then there was a 4-question perceived competence scale, and this scale we actually adjusted because normally it's course specific. So normally it would ask questions like, how competent do you feel in your ability to succeed at the coursework in, say, college algebra? But I actually adjusted the wording to be more general. So it read, how competent do you feel in your ability to graduate from college? So the questions were worded more for general collegiate coursework. Why latent class analysis? Most of the studies that I read about involved variable-oriented approaches, so using ANOVAs and regression to identify an overall trend. And I wanted to consider a person-oriented approach that would actually generate some sort of classification scheme based on generation status. And so latent class analysis, what it's going to do is it groups people based on responses to several categorical variables. So all of these survey questions could be categorized and used in the classification scheme. All right, and we want to be able to classify students to be able to say, well, first generation students in general have maybe these handicaps or have these advantages, and we can design interventions to help, whether it's first generation, second generation, or third or more generation college students based on these classification schemes. All right, so does generation matter? These are just looking at some averages of mother autonomy, perceived competence, perceived choice, and awareness of self across different generations. So still just looking at the data descriptively. And what we see is that first generation on each of the markers, first generation tends to have lower averages. Interestingly, the third generation had the lowest average mother autonomy. So mother autonomy really decreases. And probably what's happening there is you've got 3 or more generations of going to college, and the student is not given any option. It is, you will go to college and you will potentially major in such and such. All right, so with the exploratory latent class analysis, I looked at different class solutions. I looked at a 2, 3, and 4 class solution. And in each of these, I got fit statistics, the AIC and the BIC, and class probabilities. And so here, what we see is that for the 2 class solution, it had the lowest AIC and BIC, which says statistically it's the best fit. But I actually ended up examining the different class solutions deeper and looking at different variables within the class solutions. I ended up going with the 3 class solution. Even though we have a small class probability of only 10%, that 10% was statistically significant in the sense that it was important who was represented in that 10%. That 10% that popped up was quite different than the 20% or 70% that we see with the other class probabilities. And then once you get to the 4 class solution, you have a very, very small class that pops up that really has no meaning within the context of the study. And the classes were formed using generation, perceived choice, and self-determination. So I left out perceived parental support in forming the classes, but I did consider differences among perceived parental support across the classes, as we'll see in just a minute. All right, so who's in the classes? With the latent classes, I found that there was a mid-all, a low-all, and a high-all group. Let's start by looking at the low-all group. So this low-all group was actually 57% first generation, and you see a generation average there of 1.5. Again, once you break down by generation in the data, again, it comes to 57% first generation. You see a higher race average, and what that's saying is that there's a good many minority students in this particular class. Comparatively, the SES is lower, so they're financially more disadvantaged. And we see the lowest averages of perceived choice, self-determination, mother involvement, mother autonomy, mother warmth, father involvement, father autonomy, and father warmth. And so the averages are low compared to the other 2 classes in all the observed variables. Conversely, on the opposite end, there's the high-all group. And the high-all group was only 30% first generation, so primarily second and third or more generation status students. And this class had the highest averages in all the observed variables. And then there was a class that popped up that was just kind of mid-level in all the observed variables that wasn't the lowest and wasn't the highest. They're just kind of persisting through college. A couple of comments. So what do these numbers represent, and where do they come from? So on the observed variables from the scales. So because we're dealing with multi-question scales, so whether it was 10 questions for self-determination or 4 questions for perceived choice, I got some scores for all of these variables, including the mother and father scales, and broke the sum scores down into categories, and they were all given 5 categories, 5 category scales, where 5 represent the highest level of, say, mother involvement, and 3 would represent just average mother involvement, and 1 would represent low mother involvement. And so we see with the high-all group that they have very high mother autonomy at 4.4, whereas with the low all group, they have father involvement and father warmth of 2.7, so below average father involvement and father warmth. All right, I considered running SES and race as covariates. So are SES and race significant covariates? And the answer is no. It doesn't really change the fit, but they're not significant across the classes where the first class was used as the reference class. And we see that by the p-values. Do the classes differ on measures not included in the class formation? So here what I did was I looked at the mother involvement, autonomy and warmth, and the father involvement, autonomy and warmth across the classes, and do they vary? And the answer is what we already potentially see back here from the averages is that mother autonomy does vary. We see that mother autonomy was really high in that high all class, and so it does vary across the classes. And then we see that father autonomy and father warmth also significantly vary, and we see that because in that low all class, father autonomy and father warmth were well below average. So using latent class analysis, going back to the research question, what classes of students emerged? The result is that 3 distinct classes emerged: a high all, a low all, and a mid all class. The classes do strongly contradict prior research. So using latent class analysis, what classes of students emerged based on the variables of first generation college student status, perceived parental support, and academic expectations? What we see in the result is that 3 distinct classes did emerge: a high all, a low all, and a mid all group. Since the classes strongly support the classes do strongly support prior research, but more variable exploration is needed. What we do see is that the students who are coming from continuing generation families, they tend to have higher self-determination and perceived parental support. And the students who are coming typically from the first generation student status, we're seeing less self-determination, less perceived parental support, especially when it comes to the father. All right, what were the limitations of the study? It was not a very representative sample. It was a convenient sample based on my own students here at USC Upstate. There were only 70 students in the sample, so I would love to rerun this with hundreds of students. You know, what's going to change in the classes? Are more classes warranted? Do we see a first generation class that is doing well in a first generation class that is struggling more? So I would like to try to have a larger sample in the future. And there's also questions about the validity of the perceived competence scale. So I didn't, you know, the scales are established scales and the validity is already established, but I changed the wording of the scale to look at general college coursework and the idea of graduating versus specific coursework. So did I in some way alter the validity of that perceived competence scale? Future directions, using the classes to predict course performance would be extremely interesting. So, you know, if we're saying that this low all, primarily first generation class is in some way disadvantaged, does that show up in their course performance? I would definitely want to try to get into some additional data collection of learning goal orientation, course expectancy value, continued data collection for larger, more representative samples. So as I was just saying on the previous slide, you know, I'd love to get 300 to 500 students with this data and look at the class membership then. And also exploring the relationship between academic expectations and SES measures. So in that low all class, they also had lower SES. And even though it wasn't a significant covariate, what impact is that having on these students and their ability to succeed collegiately?